All right, good afternoon. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn webinar on overtime eligibility. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. My name is Rachel Lauter. I'm the Executive Director of Working Washington and the Fair Work Center. So to kick off, let's do some introductions. I'd love for you to tell me who you are, what you do, and as an icebreaker question, if you worked less, what would you do with your free time? Who wants to start?
Okay. My name is Laura Pierce. I'm the Executive Director of Washington Nonprofits, which is the state association for nonprofits. And if I had more time, I would catch up on the stack of books on my night table.
Sounds good. I'm Misha Werschkul. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. We're a nonprofit with 9 staff based in Seattle, working on advocacy around issues of economic opportunity and racial equity. And if I had more time, I would, it's a great question. I think it's a good one to think about. I think I would probably travel more or plan to travel more.
Hi, my name is Vu. I'm with Rainier Valley Corps. We are trying to bring more leaders of color into the nonprofit sector and to help organizations led by communities of color. And if I have more time, I would like to say I want to spend more time with my kids, but I think it's just going to be Netflix. If I have more time, it's just Netflix.
And okay, and I'll also answer, if I had more time, I probably would play and watch more basketball. Mm-hmm. So let's give everyone some background about what we're here for. We're talking about overtime eligibility. So there've always been 2 things that you need to be considered exempt from overtime. You need to have certain job duties that make you a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional employee, and you need to be paid above a certain amount. That amount is called the overtime exemption threshold. If you're paid less than that, you get overtime pay, period. It doesn't matter what your whether or not you're salaried or hourly, and it doesn't matter what your job title is. The reason that this exists is so that employers don't do an end run around minimum wage. And currently, Washington L&I is updating the rules around overtime eligibility. And they're doing so for the first time since 1976. The current rules say that you can be paid as little as $24,000 a year and be exempted from overtime. That's less than the minimum wage in Washington state. We at Working Washington have been advocating that the threshold be raised by 3 times the minimum wage, which is about $75,000 a year. That's not a minimum salary. What that is it's basically the minimum amount you have to be paid in exchange for working potentially unlimited hours. We've heard from lots of employer groups that any increase is too much and that we should wait for the federal government. So really we're here to have a conversation with nonprofit employers about the eligibility and the rulemaking. L&I is expected to come out with draft rules in the next few weeks. They've said that they will probably set a threshold somewhere between 2 to 2.5 times the minimum wage, and that there'll be some sort of phase-in. So once the draft rule gets released, there'll be public hearings, and then the final rule will be issued after that. So that's sort of the current landscape of the overtime rule making. Historically, overtime rules and minimum wage were first established back in the 1930s. The original overtime exemption threshold was set in 1938 at about 3 times the minimum wage. And then from the 1930s until the mid-1970s, the threshold was updated every few years, usually to a level equivalent of about 3 times to 4 times the minimum wage. Then in the mid-1970s, they stopped doing it. As I mentioned, the state hasn't updated it since 1976. The federal government updated the rules once in 2004 under President George W. Bush. He set the federal threshold at about 2.25 the federal minimum wage. And then a few years ago in 2016, the Obama administration attempted to make rulemaking, but it got tied up in the courts. So we're still, in the federal level, still back to when George W. Bush did it. So from my perspective, what happened when these rules stopped being updated is that our pay became stagnant and our work week got longer. When the rule was last changed, over 60% of the workforce was eligible for overtime. Now it's about 10% of the workforce. And it's not because we're working less. In fact, people's work weeks have gone up. There's been reports of the average work week being about 49 hours a week, with about a quarter of workers reporting that they work over 60 hours a week. People say that time is money, but right now employers are getting both of those things. So it's been about 40 years. We have an opportunity to really, turn the tide here. And that's why I'd really love to have this conversation with you all about how you see this rule happening, how you're going to implement it, what you think about it. We're just here to have an informal conversation about it. So I think my first question to all of you would be, how does expanding overtime eligibility fit in with your broader mission? So what are the values here that you see being played out in this rulemaking? And anyone can go first.
I can kick things off. So at the Washington State Budget and Policy Center, one of the things that we're working on is really trying to identify kind of policies that can be implemented at the state level, either legislatively or through executive order, that really help kind of promote economic opportunity. And what that really means is, that people, families, communities have what they need to really thrive. And that is in Seattle, that's in Spokane, that's in Omak, it's really all across the state. And, if you talk to people anywhere in the state, you basically hear the same thing, that what people want is they want to have kind of basic needs met, right? Want to be able to put food on the table for their family. They want to be able to, pay for their kids' camps and be able to do things with their family. And, they also want to have time with their family. And so people want to be working, they want to have jobs that pay them decently, but they also want to be able to not have that be the entirety of their life. And so what we've really seen happen kind of over really the last several decades especially, is that more and more and more work. There are a number of people that have no access to jobs. And then there are people who have jobs who are really working more hours than they should be working to be able to benefit them and to benefit their family. Kind of updating the overtime threshold, making sure that we kind of get back to that balance that we had a few decades ago, is ultimately about kind of what's good for families, what's good for individuals, what's good for communities, and is actually about what's good for employers too. And I kind of wear a dual role as kind of someone who's sort of thinking about the policy aspects, but also an employer myself in terms of our kind of small nonprofit. And certainly it's different in different settings, what the implementation would look like and what the challenges might be. But when I think about kind of the employees that we have at the Budget and Policy Center and nonprofit employees that I've worked with my whole life, I know that people actually having that balance and having time with their family and not feeling like their job is everything that takes up all of their time is actually good in the long run for sectors like mine, where we want people to be working and be able to do advocacy and research, not just for 6 months or a year, but really to be able to make a career in it. And we see a lot of burnout and a lot of really challenges with retention of employees because of the workload. And so ultimately, and I'll end here and give you both an opportunity to speak, but ultimately really resetting this balance around overtime is actually good for us as an employer too, because it means that people will be able to stay with us longer, have that balance that allows them to thrive throughout their life with us as an employer.
Thank you.
Well, I'm excited to see the threshold increase and also to see it have an escalation automatically built in, because the minimum wage will be increasing. If it's connected with that, then the threshold will increase. I think that, yeah, we all want to see better compensation across the nonprofit sector. People are dramatically underpaid in a lot of different fields. So I think that's good. I do feel, we're a membership organization. We polled over 400 of our nonprofit members about this issue to try to better understand where they're at. And I think, the challenges just come with the implementation of it. But I think that'll be interesting to get a little deeper into as we go. But I think that we all want reasonable work-life balance for staff. And I think nonprofit folks are very passionate, and so we do need to make sure that they're not overworking themselves because of their passion for the mission.
Yeah, I'm really glad for this legislation to be considered, and I don't know, this is definitely not my area of expertise. We have way more experienced and knowledgeable leaders on this panel, but I do see that we have a scarcity mindset in the sector a lot of times, and it leads to us underpaying our staff, and it's pervasive across the sector. Not just the underpay, but just like the lack of family leave, for example, paid family leave, Some of us are sitting on really crappy chairs that we duct tape together. And this is just, it's across the board. And I think this is really critical. We lose people from our sector because we don't pay them enough and we don't respect them and their time. And in Seattle, it seems like a lot of them become real estate agents and, and leave the sector. And so I think this is great for us to do this, and we shouldn't be waiting for the federal government to be doing this. They have not increased the federal minimum wage for a long, long time. It's like, what, $7.25 or something? And that's just ridiculous. No one can live on $7.25 here in Seattle. But many of us still perpetuate many of these things. Rainier Valley Corps, for example, we have a fellowship program, and we were paying our fellows $13 an hour. And this is not, you can't live on that. So our fellows started to have conversations with us, and we did some research and talked to others, and we increased how much we pay our fellows. But even we, an equity-focused organization, we can still be trapped by this scarcity mindset. So I'm glad about this. But I also really agree with Laura's point, which is we have to think about how we phase this in. Rainier Valley Corps works with a lot of very small grassroots organizations, and $70,000 exemption level, that's going to affect a lot of organizations. And I think we should have to be very mindful about that.
Thank you for that perspective. Misha, can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of folks that will be impacted by this? What types of jobs we're talking about?
Yeah, and we were just talking a little bit about this before the panel. You know, sometimes it's hard to get really precise data on who's impacted. We rely on data, national data that the Economic Policy Institute generates, kind of state by state estimates of the number of people impacted. And so they're estimates, but you know, when we talk about raising the overtime threshold to 2.5 times the minimum wage, that would impact about 400,000 workers in our state. Those aren't obviously all nonprofit workers. That is, you know, workers in all types of different sectors. I don't have the precise estimates for nonprofit workers, but we know that nonprofits are, you know, it's a big industry, and it ranges from really small grassroots organizations like Vu mentioned to really some of the largest employers in our communities, nonprofit hospitals, nonprofit health insurers. And so there's a lot of variation within the nonprofit sector. One of the things we look at when we look at data oftentimes is kind of look at sort of within that group of who benefits within that group, and break down by gender, race, industry, occupation. And so I'll just share a little bit of that data. You know, what we know in Washington State, and this is true nationally too, is that updating that overtime threshold has a particular benefit for women workers. So there's a higher concentration of female workers in that group that would be impacted than versus the you know, employment as a whole. Also for Latinx or Hispanic workers, there's a kind of disproportionate benefit there. But ultimately, you know, we're talking about 400,000 workers who might benefit. So that's people of all races, people of all areas of our state, people of all genders. Finally, I'll just note that, you know, when we think about kind of who's the most impacted in terms of occupations, the kind of data shows that the most impacted are management, business, and financial occupations, professional and related occupations. Those are big classifications. Service occupations, sales, and office and administrative support. So it really is a broad swath of workers in our communities. You know, people who work in the service industry, in fast food, in you know, dining establishments, people who are working in office settings. I think where we see the disproportionate impact on gender oftentimes has to do with administrative support workers, which traditionally has been kind of a female-dominated occupation. There's a lot of women working in office settings who really should be covered by the overtime threshold now, but haven't been because of the failure to update this threshold. So that's just a little bit of the data to share.
That's very helpful. So I want to dig in a little bit to the proposal now, because I think, you know, one of the things that we've heard is that the phasing is really critical here, right? That like changing these, because it hasn't changed for 40 years, we really need to be able to be smart about how we phase this in, you know, to implement it. So I'm curious, just, you know, as you're thinking about this, what would be a comfortable timeline for you if the state decides to go to 2.5x the minimum wage or to 2x the minimum wage? You know, have you heard from your members, and have you thought about this, or what would be the best sort of phase in for you guys?
This has been a really tough one because of the funding models that nonprofits have. And of course, they're varied and the people we represent are very diverse. But in general, we have a structural problem in that the funders are not prepared to increase their funding to cover this cost. And, we could actually dig down into, the different issues that presented by government funding, by foundations, by individual giving, but in no area is there any commitment that compensation should be increased. And the state is actually planning to implement this. And so far, there's no commitment from the state that they will raise their own contracting levels in a way that would offset the additional cost to nonprofits. So this is one of the big things we would like to do and would invite all of you to get involved in, is making sure that if the state believes in this, then they show that by increasing their contracting levels. But so there are these challenges with the funders and sort of where the money is going to come from. So that's a big thing with an unknown timeline, because how long will it take us to convince them that this is a good investment? And then the other thing we face is the state budget cycle. And one of the challenges now is that this rule will be implemented around the same time that the coming biennial budget is going to be finalized. So for 2 years, there's not an there are some opportunities, obviously, to lobby in the mid-year, but it will be harder to get that increased funding if it's not in this budget cycle. So for a lot of state-funded nonprofits, their first opportunity to renegotiate might be 2 years from this summer. So that is a really big challenge when it comes to implementing at a reasonable pace.
I don't know. It might be helpful for us to look at the phasing in of the minimum $15 minimum wage over here. So we should probably learn some lessons in this. $70K is a lot of money. A lot of executive directors of smaller organizations are not making $70,000. They're going to be making less. Yeah. And I can't imagine an executive director who is not exempt. Right. I don't know. It might be good for our sector to be like, you know what? I can only work 40 hours. So sorry, bye. I'm leaving now. It's Friday. Goodbye. Right. Because we do tend to attract people who tend to be very dedicated to the job. And so we will work until it gets done, whether we are paid right or not.
This is one of the things that we hear from workers about, is that it's not always about the money and wanting to be paid time and a half. It's about the time, right? That so it's not necessarily time to go home, and maybe
I'm also and if I had not put in the 60 hours a week, I don't think I would have been successful. So this is, we have to look at these balances. And also, it's not just EDs who are being affected, it's line staff that we have to really think about as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are an awful lot of nonprofit professionals that do meet the duties test. I think a good example might be a mental health therapist or a social worker. And the starting pay for master's level mental health specialists working with chronically homeless people is $38,000 a year. So, I mean, we complain about our public school teachers not being paid enough, but that is a substantially lower amount. I guess, I want those folks to have some protections, but I also want them to have the flexibility to do their job in the manner that they see fit. And so I think it's tricky, and it's also, again, it's going to be a big crunch. I wish we had better compensation data on the nonprofit sector, but I know, especially outside King County, that the vast majority of managers and skilled professionals like that are well under this threshold. And as Boo said, a lot of executive directors are also in the threshold.
I find it alarming that, being a mental health specialist like this and being paid $38,000 a year. I mean, it's so underpaid, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's the problem, right? Like that's not necessarily an obstacle to doing this. This is about increasing people's wages or giving them more time.
Yeah. So I agree, and I think we should get the wages up. And it's just figuring out where the money will come from to do it. And I think we have to constantly be advocating and educating legislators and other people in a position to influence funding about what the true costs of doing things are. I think the nonprofit sector has dug a deep hole for itself. Partially that scarcity mentality of, we're going to sacrifice and we're going to do it all for less. But also as government has outsourced what were previously public sector, unionized, well-benefited jobs to the nonprofit sector, and the nonprofit sector has competed to get those contracts. It's been kind of a race to the bottom. So I think we do need to address these larger issues. I think, I'm trying to figure out the order of events in my mind of how we get to where we want to be. The other thing I do hear from nonprofits, and this definitely came through on our survey, was there is a worry about the loss of flexibility that comes with this if you raise the level too high. Because the majority of nonprofits that I've talked to say that they will convert exempt jobs to non-exempt, and they will forbid overtime. And so the people will have to stay within their 40-hour work week because that's all the money that's available. And the challenge with that is that nonprofits often need flexible staffing. And so they can't work hard in the run up to a big event and then take time off the following week under this, the new rule. So that's an interesting potential dissatisfier to a lot of people that will be in this band that gets affected.
Interesting. I think we'll talk about them in a bit. Misha, I'd love to hear just a little bit.
Well, and I agree with what's been said. And I think, we had kind of this like trial run a little bit with the Obama administration working to implement the federal threshold in 2016, I think it was. And a lot of nonprofits sort of looked at what is it going to take to comply with the Obama threshold then,
Right.
And we're really making plans towards moving in that direction. And so I think from a kind of thinking about phase in, one approach would be to go to that threshold, quickly, and then a couple of years to get to a higher threshold. That would be one option that I think would make sense, since a lot of nonprofits have kind of already gone through the planning to get to that level.
And that level is like 47.
Yeah, it was like 47.
Yeah.
And then some kind of phase in after that. I think one other thing on the phase in is, from my perspective as a small employer, we don't have an HR department, right? We don't have that infrastructure that large employers do. I think actually a simple approach is really important, and, keeping it as kind of streamlined as possible to understand what the responsibilities are at an employer. It doesn't really help me, as I don't feel as an employer, to have, 10 different categories with different phase-in schedules, different things happening, because it just becomes very difficult to track. And I think that, so I'm a proponent of kind of a phase in with some simplicity around it, maybe one threshold for small employers, one for bigger, but not, a bunch of different categories that create the opportunity for me to mess up, because I'm not an HR professional, but I happen to play one in my executive director role. And then the last thing is, I just think what you said about advocacy is really important. And Vu, your comment about the scarcity mindset, I think you've been really a strong proponent of how do we educate the funder community as well. And I think that goes to both nonprofits and, both to kind of philanthropy and government, is we have to be advocates to really making the case about why this is an important move for our sector. And I think, as a nonprofit employer, when there is something that I feel really important that we need to do, I go to my funders and I make the case to them. We really want to do strategic planning. Can you help us fund that? We really want to do, when we went through an executive director transition, our funders helped us really get through that. And I think it's on all of us too, to really go out in the way that you're saying and really educating our funders to say, this isn't good for any of us to have people so low paid, working, till they're, barely like able to even function and come back to work the next day. That's not serving any of us. And so we need to work to make these adjustments together. So I just, as an advocate, I think we can play that role that you're talking about.
It might be helpful to actually have this as a reason to approach funders and say, look, okay, we've been underpaying our staff, but now it's going to be against the law and you got to help us out. And I do think that we have to address this sort of disdain that philanthropy has for paying for staffing. It's like, oh, we love paying for computers or whatever, but not the people actually running the programs, because that's just overhead or whatever. And that has been very harmful to the work that we're trying to do. And I really do think philanthropy needs to change and acknowledge the realities that nonprofits are working within, because otherwise we're not going to be able to achieve the goals that we are all trying to accomplish. Right? I think philanthropy needs to just like stop it with this 5% annual payout thing. I've been encouraging it's just like we need to double. We need to double the annual payout so there's enough funding back into the sector.
Yeah, and we actually just got an online question that asks, is there an effort underway to organize funders to get on board with this, right? To sort of be partners in expanding this, someone that would, require additional funding, which I think is a really good question. I think that there's not necessarily an organized effort the way that we are organized to expand the overtime eligibility threshold, but that, in this conversation, it makes me think that we really should be having a deeper conversation with funders about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And we're in conversation with funders to some extent. And we try to raise these kinds of issues regularly. And our members, that's one of their, it was interesting when I went out and did my listening tour as a new executive director, what do member nonprofits want from us? And we asked about advocacy priorities, and I was thinking public policy change, and they were like, talk to the funders, so they want us to serve in that role. And however, the funders are not the easiest to sway. They have a lot of confidence, some might say arrogance in their position. They believe that they're acting in the interests of the people that we serve by trying to make us as lean as possible. And they are also imposing a lot of new requirements on nonprofits to professionalize, to be data-driven, to do formal evaluation. These are all the sorts of work that those exempt employees do. And so I don't know. I had the executive director of another progressive organization here in town say, you should just go talk to the Gates Foundation, the Bezos Foundation. And I just, pictured the conversation with Jeff Bezos about why we should be paying our people more. And I couldn't quite get past that, being a kind of a comical thought. As far as the funders them organizing each other, I don't see a lot of that happening. I do think it's exciting that there are some new books and new voices out there that are critical of organized philanthropy, that are calling it out for being colonial in nature and problematic, that we know that the wealth is in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that fewer and fewer people are donating to charity. The amount of giving hasn't gone down dramatically, but the number of people that control those gifts has. So it's a very anti-democratic kind of a trend. That trend doesn't line up well with our argument that working people should be paid more. So I'd love to hear if some of you all are aware of more promising opportunities to organize. I mean, Vu, you are in dialogue with philanthropists a lot. Do you see a lot of opening for movement there?
It's been a little frustrating, honestly. I think communities, especially marginalized communities, have been incredibly frustrated. We've had multiple conversations. There are wonderful funders and program officers out there, but I do believe that the way philanthropy is structured prevents a lot of progress from being made. So there are great individuals, but if the systems that are put into place are there, it's not really responsive to change, then this is an issue that we've been having. Just a couple of years ago, after the election, we had a great gathering of foundation program officers and many leaders of color to say, this is urgent. The executive orders are coming and people are getting separated and there's the travel bans and everyone was freaking out. And we had within 2 weeks, we pulled 100 leaders, 50 from foundations and 50 from organizations. And it was great. We had this great, wonderful conversation about what we would actually change, and absolutely nothing happened. A year later, we had another one. It's like, hey, it's been a year now. Can we actually get together and talk about stuff? Then we did. Same number of people, great energy, and absolutely nothing happened. And I'm glad that there are books like Winners Take All and Decolonizing Wealth, and I think Just Giving and others that are coming out. And another leader told me that we need to really do something, because otherwise there's going to be more and more public anger towards philanthropy and towards the nonprofit sector. And then people who may not know anything about our sector start enacting policies that may not be good for us. So I think philanthropy and nonprofits it's in our best interest and the interest of the effectiveness of our work to actually start thinking about policy and legislation that we can propose ourselves, such as increasing the payout rate, for example, or having more regulations around donor advice funds, because right now they're not very well regulated. There's no requirement for giving out any certain amount of money, and some just sit there. And I think we have to just be more thoughtful, and I think we have to be more assertive with our funding partners.
I think the funding point is really is well taken, and also the potential phase in for an overtime rule tied to a biennium for a state budget, right? To really think through, how we can consider those costs. But again, and maybe I sound like a broken record, I think one of the things that we're hearing all the time from employees and workers is that this isn't necessarily about money, it's really about time. And so, that's one of the things I want to stress for other nonprofit leaders who are listening to this and nonprofit workers, which is that it doesn't always have to be about getting, costing it in so that you're paying time and a half, but they're really thinking about how are we going to manage our organization such that we can let folks go home after 40 hours a week, and then they can spend more time with their families and contribute more to their community, and sort of flip that scarcity mindset and actually, have this idea of abundance, of like an abundance of time, really, being able to spend it with your family and your community. And that's really what, as an ED, I'm also thinking about that, right? Which is making sure that my folks know that, it's time to go home. And how do you do that and manage that?
I think that reminded me too, one other thing I think is important is, the reality is, and you gave the numbers at the beginning, like the percent of our workforce that's covered by the threshold has so significantly decreased that most or a lot of employers don't really have that much experience. Like I will say for us, at the Budget and Policy Center, we didn't have anyone that we didn't consider exempt until about a year ago. And then we have somebody now who is. And so, and I've mentioned this to you before, Laura, that, it's like the first time we've ever as an organization really figured out how to pay someone and have somebody who's not considered exempt. And I think, in bigger organizations, that isn't so much the case, but with only about 6% of the workforce covered right now, we actually just have to get a little bit smarter about how do we kind of comply in ways that kind of protect flexibility and protect, those things that we care about. And I think, we have at least I did, sort of an antiquated notion of what it means to have someone who's not paid salary, because we have just gotten so used to paying everybody salaried. And there actually is, I think, more sort of, and maybe there is more work that we need to do there, even, is to really make sure that, we can have, some of our workforce who's exempt, some of our workforce who's not exempt, and we can still have kind of flexibility and work-life balance and all those things for all of our employees. So I think there's just like a little bit of a learning curve too, that we should just own and acknowledge And part of whatever this phase in should be is about like, how do we make sure that we are actually educating ourselves about how to comply? Because it's just not an area, at least I had a lot of expertise in.
Yeah, this is an area where we've done a lot of work with our learning program to try to make sure nonprofits know how to run legally. And we really pushed a lot of the state agencies to work with us to ensure that nonprofits are complying and to give us resources to help train nonprofits so they can comply. And I do think there's some opportunities for creativity with this and having people understand it. We have gotten some pushback from some nonprofits that, you know, they're going to have to track hours and there's going to be additional administrative costs to that, and that's overhead, and who's going to pay for that? And, you know, they sort of spiral out of control. And I think that there are some challenges there with how under-resourced the HR function is at most nonprofits. But, you know, one creative solution that I have heard is change how your work week falls. So if your work week is Sunday to Saturday, which is the most typical defined work week, then no one can work more than 40 hours in that work week. But I had one nonprofit tell me that they have events that are often on the weekend for the community. And so they had set their work week something like Thursday through Wednesday. And that if people worked a lot of hours over the weekend, they would take off on Monday or Tuesday to make it up before the end of the work week. So that's a good thing that I hadn't thought about, that gives you a little bit more flexibility with the loss of kind of more traditional kind of comp time arrangements with this.
I want to give opportunity before I go to some of the questions that we've gotten online and from people who are RSVP, but any other sort of comments, concerns, things you want to raise about, you know, this rulemaking that's going to happen. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline going forward, but other things, I mean, we mentioned obviously the phase-in and the timing and funding sources and flexibility. Are there other things that as nonprofit leaders you guys are concerned about that we should talk about?
I would stress what Misha said earlier about just how this affects women and people of color, both in just how this might benefit many of the workers in our sector, but also how the phasing might also affect them, because many of these organizations led by women, people of color, and people from other marginalized communities are going to be smaller. And I think they're going to be affected disproportionately. And we need to be thoughtful about that.
One thing that you mentioned about the executive directors that we've been thinking about a little bit at Working Washington is that business owners are currently exempted under the rules. For overtime rules, but not nonprofit EDs. You know, I think that there's both sides of that, right? We can argue that actually we shouldn't be advocating for the exemption of EDs, but that's a possible policy solution that, you know, you can put on the table as we're advocating with LNI when they release their rules.
Could you clarify that?
Oh, that basically an executive director. Sorry, the question from the audience was, can I clarify that? Essentially, the current rules for overtime in Washington State exempt business owners, meaning they're not eligible for overtime. So a possible parallel could be that an executive exempt from overtime pay.
I wanted to add one thing too on what we were saying before about the need for outreach to employers, and I think that we should advocate for funding for that, for groups like Washington Nonprofits and others who are really working with this network of organizations. I also think like there should be the same outreach to workers, and that, you know, right now the rules are so complicated and outdated that most people don't know what they're entitled to when it comes to overtime. And I think we're going to get to a place with minimum wage where it's like, you know, more well-known and clear what the standards are. But I think that it should be, you know, there should be outreach happening and funded outreach to workers as well, so that people know what they're entitled to. So it should be happening on both sides.
Yeah, well, we're certainly Working Washington and Fair Work, so that's, you know, a lot of what we do, which is outreach about knowing your rights at work, and would certainly advocate for additional funding for community-based outreach on this, because we feel like it's so important.
I think one other thing I would add too is, unfortunately, I think we're still wrestling with some potential unintended consequences of this. One of the things we've talked with Labor and Industries about is that in our survey, 35% of respondents said they would have to cut health benefits, that they would cut their health insurance because that's how they would find the money to pay these salaries. We also heard that at least a quarter would cut services, a quarter would lay off staff, a lot of negative impacts. And some people said they would raise fees for their services, but others said we can't raise fees. We serve Medicaid population, we serve low-income populations, and we can't. So I think, I was trying to explore with Elle and I whether there could be some kind of credit for benefits, for example, and the answer is no, not under the labor rules. It's strictly about money, cash compensation. So I think that's just will continue to be a challenge for us.
I hear the concerns. I think one of the things that we often hear every time we advocate for raising a worker standard, a labor standard, is that we're going to have to cut services, or we're going to have to close our business, right? It was the same conversation, or not the exact same, but a similar conversation when we raised the minimum wage, which was all these businesses said, we're going to cut jobs, or we're going to have to close locations, and it hasn't happened.
It has happened in the nonprofit sector. I beg to differ. There definitely have been a lot of cuts and job loss because of the minimum wage increase. It's not really well documented because we don't have, I know we would love to do more research on that, and we have capacity issues, and I don't think there's a lot of, the nonprofit sector doesn't have a lot of people doing research on it, putting that out there. But I can tell you anecdotally that it's definitely happening, particularly in Eastern Washington, is where I'm hearing a lot of cases. So I am completely supportive of raising the minimum wage. I'm really glad we did it. I would love for us to think creatively about how to get wages up for traditionally underpaid segments of the nonprofit sector, like childcare workers and home health care aides. I think, we need to continuously be working to bring up the bottom. So I'm completely supportive, but it is not correct to say that it hasn't resulted in job loss.
Well, all evidence is that there's been job growth in Washington State. I don't know I'd love to see more data about the nonprofit sector. But
yeah. Overall, that's a good point. Yeah.
That Washington State just experienced so much job growth in the last few years. I think, but that's just to say that, there's real concerns. I think there's fear in this because it's major change, because for the last 40 years, we haven't changed the rules. And I think to Misha's point, it's both an outreach conversation to employers and to workers about really how we can get this thing done. And actually, to your point about cost, we got an interesting and very creative question online that I'll pose to you all. Was what would it mean if we had a multifaceted approach, like a nonprofit workers union and or a collective benefits marketplace available to nonprofits through organizations like yours, Laura, that could offset some of these potential costs? Can we collectively advocate for funding of administrative costs? And really, what is the true cost of burnout and turnover? So that's a multi-part question, but I do think that there's some interesting ideas here about what we can do as a sector collectively to advocate for, cost savings. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I think it's good for us to explore these different options. RVC, for example, we are now doing this operation support program where we actually handle a lot of the back office, QuickBooks, HR for the organization that we provide the service for. It's way more efficient. Everyone's happier because they don't have to deal with many of the operations that are very critical, right? What I would probably try to avoid us is really trying to chase after these magic bullets, right? Or these panacea that we think would just solve everything. I think the reality is we need to get funding to pay people more. And so kind of going back to what Laura says, we have to talk to the funders who are oftentimes not aware of the restrictions that we have. And even though job growth has been up overall, I can totally see from a nonprofit that we need to have more data on that because we don't have the same revenue streams and models over here. We rely on donations and foundations. If that does not increase along with the level of services that's required by the community, then I think that's going to be a disproportionate sort of issue that we need to have. So yes, exploring, but I think So some of it's just very basic. Foundations need to give more. Governments need to pay more.
You should have any thoughts?
Well, it doesn't really respond to the question so much, but more of kind of your comment too. I think, within the nonprofit sector, there's just so much variation that it's also, I think, really helpful and has been for me to really dig into the specifics and really think about what is the right solution in a specific area. So what makes sense for us at the Budget and Policy Center is probably totally different than what makes sense for a large health insurance provider or a really small grassroots community organizing focused nonprofit or a direct service provider that's relying 100% on government contracts. And I think it's just really important for employers to really ask the question about, do I really need someone to be working more than 40 hours a week? And in some cases, the answer is probably yes. There might be, human needs that you're responding to as a therapist, and you have to do that. And in other cases, it's well, just because we've been doing it for 40 years doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. And so, for us, and again, I recognize that in my organization, it's probably easier than in a lot of other organizations. We don't do direct service. And, I still think it's helpful for all of us to ask the question about, Vu, your question about as an executive director, do executive directors really need to work more than 40 hours a week? Maybe they do, or maybe they don't, and just really digging into that question. Because I think a lot of times the adjustments that we can make are really about kind of giving that better balance to people to allow them more time outside of work. And maybe, a couple times a year, you go over 40 hours and you pay someone overtime and there's a cost associated with that, but not necessarily that we need to convert everyone and move everyone into, we don't necessarily, we should raise everyone's wages, but maybe as a response to this, it's not always about raising wages. It's about, hey, for this position, I actually can make it work with 40 hours for the most part. And just at least challenging ourselves and asking that question.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I love the idea of organizing the nonprofit sector and coming up with collaborative, collective solutions wherever we can.
Yeah, here. One of the questions we got from someone who RSVP'd to the event and who works at a education-based nonprofit. Some nonprofits will surely say we can't afford this, as we've discussed. How do we shift the culture towards making sure actual time worked is time paid? What's the cost really of impacts on employee wellness, burnout, turnover? They are surely higher, and isn't it time that we recognize this? So I think Misha, actually goes to what you were just saying, really, which is, how do we think about this as nonprofit leaders around what is beyond the cost of what this proposal might be to us? What is the cost to us as a community and to our organization for burning out our workers? And that's something that I would just I'd stress that other nonprofit leaders who are listening to this really think about. And what benefit do we get? What do we earn and gain by letting people go home and giving them more time? I think that's a real conversation that we should be having amongst ourselves.
Yeah, I think we need to share some of that information with nonprofits more broadly. And we had Beth Cantor as a speaker at our conference last year. She wrote a book called The Happy, Healthy Nonprofit, which is very much about creating a culture of wellness. And this year we'll have Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who deals with recovery from trauma and dealing with vicarious trauma in the sector. So, we're thinking a lot about wellness, and I don't think we all probably work harder than we should. I know I heard on the radio the other day that there's a new research study out that people in their 50s should work, the optimum amount for them to work every week is 25 hours a week. That's when they get the most done. Wow. So I've been thinking a lot about that. Sounds pretty good to me. So, how do we get more dialogue about that? I think it's exciting to think about what might be possible there.
That's great. And then I'll do one final question from RSVPs, and then we'll wrap up. But this is more of just a tactical historical question. A local nonprofit worker asked, how is this proposal similar or different from the Obama era proposal that got tied up in court? And as Misha mentioned, so in 2016, the Obama administration did rulemaking a DOL that was going to raise the threshold to about $48,000 a year. And it was based on an analysis of wages in the United States South, and it was set at about earnings of the 40th percentile of the salaried workers in that region. And it was also set at about 3.1x the federal minimum wage. So similar, different, but very similar in the sense that, the Washington state proposal is tied to, a multiple of the minimum wage, but a little bit different given the sort of the wage data that they used for that rulemaking. And then, are there any other audience questions? Anything? All right. Yeah.
I have a question. I know y'all spoke a little bit about like what the different like next steps are for the process, but I was just curious what y'all perceive as like the likelihood that this is going to pass on the state level, and sort of like a follow-up to that is if it doesn't pass on the state level, like is there like movement like on the local or city or county level to try to implement something?
So the question is, what's the likelihood of this is actually going to happen in the state level, and is there potential movement for local or other forums for change? So our understanding is that this is moving forward for sure. The Department of Labor and Industries (L&I) is sort of the pre-rule drafts. It's a pre-rulemaking, and that their intention is that in the next couple of weeks that they're actually going to release their first initial draft rule. And they've indicated that it'll be between 2x to 2.5x the minimum wage as the threshold. And then my understanding is that the draft rule will come with an economic analysis and a small business impact analysis, that there'll be several public hearings. So an opportunity for us to, comment additionally and have conversations with L&I. And that, a final rule will take effect probably in 2020, but as we've discussed, likely with a lot of advocacy, some kind of phase in that allows for the sectors, like nonprofit sectors, to really implement it and comply. So, there's also, there's always a threat that they'll get sued for this, just similarly to what happened with the federal government, but we'll be tracking this because we feel like it's such an important, issue to tackle. So I wanted to just open it up at the end and see if there's anything else that folks wanted to say. Any closing thoughts about overtime eligibility or the funder community? If you wanted to, share anything else, let us know.
Well, I think the learning for me has been fantastic by digging into talking about this issue and what are the real implications of it, and how do we advocate for reasonable compensation in the sector. I think there's a huge need for more data that is specific to the nonprofit sector that helps us better understand. Like I'm very intrigued by, you're right, the economy's strong, jobs are growing, and yet my gut feeling is that has not been equally shared by nonprofits. But I would love data to better understand that. So I think it's a great dialogue. I think that this has been kind of under the radar because it's a rulemaking process and it's not being debated in the legislature. So it's just interesting that it's coming at us this way. It's taken a while to get people's attention to it. And actually the hearings have not been very well attended by anyone, I would say. So it's been an interesting process to be a part of. But I'm glad that we're in it, talking about it, and just trying to understand the nuances of how it will affect different types of nonprofits differentially.
I don't have too much to add. I just really appreciate kind of you all being here and the work that you're doing and the advocacy to update the rule and then make sure that it's done in a way that really works for employers and workers in our state is really important. There is kind of a little bit in response to an earlier question, there is kind of movement happening in other states as well. And so the hope would be, I think from my perspective, that, in the absence of action at the federal level, would have liked to be seeing this happen for workers all across the country, but at least we can move forward at the state level all across the country until we're at a place where there can be federal action as well. And I think, it's just, I just really appreciate, I think this is anytime change can be hard, and it's, there's a lot of fear when change happens. And I know in the nonprofit sector, it often feels like there's all these things coming at us all the time that we're trying to respond to, including, accomplishing our missions as organizations and serving people. And I think this is probably an opportunity actually to make some adjustments in ways that we should have been adjusting before. And so if we do this in a smart way, it helps to kind of correct for some of the things that have built over time, Laura, that you talked about kind of the shift of responsibility from the public to the private sector, and the fact that much of the nonprofit industry has kind of been built on this business model of kind of low wages and a lot of work on employees. And this might be, sometimes it's hard to make those changes if you're just one nonprofit trying to make the change, and having kind of a universal standard across the state might be just the thing that helps us get moving in the right direction. So that's my hopeful side.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative that we are having this conversation, and thank you to you all for tuning in to this conversation. This is probably not the most exciting part of your day. Right? Usually when I write these types of policy wonky things, I have to add 12 pictures of baby animals to keep people awake. So I appreciate it. I do think this is important for us to tackle. We have some of the most dedicated people in our sector who will just work endless hours all the time, and just so much that we sacrifice just to make our community better. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and to compensate people fairly, not just in this way, but also with paid family leave and professional development budgets. These are all things that we need to start thinking about holistically. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this very productive conversation. And we've heard from thousands of workers throughout the state that this is important to them. And we're looking forward to participating more in the public hearings that happen through the rulemaking process. And if folks who are listening or folks in the audience are interested in getting more involved and learning more, we have plenty of information on our website, which is workinglaw.org. And thank you guys so much.
Thank you.